Dictionary, Latin. Lakota Dictionary in 2008, and then I think they presented one here, a newer version. SICC stands for Saskatchewan Indian Culture Center, which created free online courses for various American Indian language. They use white hats, orthography, but change the dots to whatever those little marks are, to grave accents, and accompanying the adjective with the diacritic, whatever that means.
And your ejectives.
Takini, used by Violet Ketches, a native speaker linguist who heads the Lakota, how do you say that? Kia Language Preservation Project, was aims to produce language speaking materials. NetSuyan, used by various websites as a way to type Siouan languages using ordinary keyboard characters. This language assessment we developed, doesn't matter which one of these orthographies you use, how you use it, all our assessment does is, are you helping our children learn to speak and understand the language? It doesn't matter what orthography you use. Let me go back to the beginning. Like I said, my name is Christopher Bordeaux. I'm Executive Director of the Oceti Sakowin Education Consortium, and I talked about the Oral Language Proficiency Assessment. And our vision is that our children will learn their language so they'll know who they are, where they come from, and to be good relatives. Teaching future Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota generations to speak shall ensure the sharing and passing on of knowledge, preserving, renewing, strengthening the language and culture, thus providing a foundation for our children's identity. So we'll always be here. The intent of our language system is to help our children to become Lakota, Dakota, Nakota speaking individuals who can be good relatives, and it provides identity. To develop standards while respecting all, speaking truthfully, mutually support this project and each other, giving 100% commitment to the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota language communication with an open mind, to develop unified standards that entail language and all of the cultural values of the Oceti Sakowin. Our guiding principles to advise the standards writing group to recognize the standards include Dakota, Lakota, Nakota worldwide, assist in locating resources relevant to writers, advocate an opening of communication, build bridges between this process and language keepers, advocate in the community, facilitate an understanding of proper protocols and etiquette. And the chronology is a long time ago, probably 20 plus years ago. We were trying to get something through the Bureau, and they kept shutting us down. So and this is the OSET group. So when we were sitting around talking about, well, what's our next step? And someone brought up, well, everybody is doing language. Why don't we come up with an assessment that it doesn't matter how they're teaching it, but that they're teaching it. So we got together a bunch of language people from all the different tribal schools in South Dakota. And we brought them together in a meeting and we told them we want to develop an assessment for the language. How can we do that? And we left them alone for a whole day. We left the meeting and we all left. End of the day we came back and they had notes up on the walls all the way around the room. And so we said, what did you come up with? So they started to talk about it, and the first thing they came up with reading and writing. So we stopped them and we said, we don't want reading and writing, we want to help children speak and understand the language. So they were real quiet for a while. Pretty soon one of them got up and tore all the papers down on reading and writing and said, I think I understand what you're saying. So from that point on, the only thing was develop an assessment that you could go in any school, anywhere, and assess the students and see if that school is helping them learn to speak and understand the language. And to me that's a scary concept for schools, because everybody looks at all these different orthographies that I presented, and there's probably more out there that people are developing on their own. And people ask me about that. What orthography? What marks do you use? Do you use marks? I said, don't matter. What matters is speaking and understanding the language. That's what matters. So we, of course, what we all do is look around for funds. And so the Bureau had extra funds, so we wrote a proposal, and then we just, whatever money we had with OSET, we just started putting all of these people together. And it was from all these tribal schools in the state of South Dakota. And we went through a long process. We went to every school board, we went to tribes, we got resolutions to support us. And it just so happened that the Bureau was, as they always are, in trouble with the IG office in DC, and they came and interviewed our director at the time, Ted Hamilton. So he called me up one day and he said, they want me to come to Washington and do a testimony. And he said, why don't you come over and we'll write some testimony. So we did. We spent a day writing testimony that he was going to give in DC. And at the end of it, he kind of laughed and he said, you know, I bet you by Friday, and this was a Wednesday, he said, I bet you by Friday we're going to get a call from the Bureau. And they're going to say, we'll give you a whole bunch of money to do your language stuff. Because they're afraid of what I'm going to say about them or what we're going to say about them. So he left that next day and stopped and visited his family in Illinois and then went on to DC. And Tuesday was when he was going to give his presentation. So I waited for him. He finally called me and he said, well, I got done, and I said, okay, and he said, you'll never believe what happened. He said, I was walking the halls of Congress, and I heard somebody running up behind me, and it was Stan Holder, who worked for the Bureau at the time. And And the first thing he said was, "Did you get my memo?" And Ted said, "No." He said, "Well, I faxed you a memo last Friday." He said, "Well, I wasn't in the office." He said, "We gave you $998,000 to do your language." So I asked Ted, "Well, did you change your testimony?" He said, "No." So we took that money and we organized all of these language instructors from all the tribal schools, plus other special ed people who were, we identified that taught English, and in all these it was tribal schools that did this. We got them all together and we said, "This is what we want you to do." Then we also organized an advisory council that when they produce something, they take it to this advisory council. And I think Earl was on it, Earl Bowhead and Robert Tucro, Tammy Dakota, can't remember who all was on there. And we met once a month, all weekend, starting Friday night till Sunday, late Sunday afternoon. And they developed this oral language proficiency assessment. And I'll go through it real simply here. And it was the time of No Child Left Behind, so we based it on that with basic, proficient, advanced, and did I forget anything? Hope not. Get old so I forget things. Historically, to get beyond the loss of culture and language through a range of activities, teaching designed to give confidence to children and young adults so they can efficiently, effectively learn the LDN language. And our goals were to continue to learn to speak the language, the dialects appropriately through schools, colleges, community efforts, to foster existing language learning approaches such as bilingual, immersion, everyday informal speech, maintain the language as an essential element of the Oceti Sakowin, retain it as an integral part of being native in spite of the past. Establish content standards. How many standards would you think that we needed to do this? Because it's so complicated. Anybody have a guess? 4? 10? 1. Close. 2. Students will speak Lakota, Nakota languages in conversation. Students will understand oral Lakota, Nakota language in conversation. And that's all we need is 2 standards to build on. Speaking it and understanding it. So the one thing the writers did, assessment writers, is they started to work on developing a test for grades K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and high school. And that, remember, like I said, this was based on No Child Left Behind and how they did things. And also to develop a practice test that they could use, building off of standardized tests, and how standardized tests are done every year. And then plan on piloting it and the technical difficulties of piloting it. and then prepare the students for this kind of test. Develop a rubric for grades 2, 5, 8, and 11. And introduce a benchmarking video and identifying anchors. And all of that is, No Child Left Behind stuff. Administer the pilot tests, score the tests, collect and interpret data, determine performance layers, and develop cut scores. In the Common Core reading standards, ask and answer question to determine understanding of a text, referring explicitly to the text on the basis for the answers, refer to details, examples, when drawing inferences, quote accurately from a text. Those were the Common Core standards at the time. Students will be able to speak appropriate vocabulary for descriptive conversation according to developmental age. And that's all based, again, on No Child Left Behind, because on the ages. And these are Common Core with prompting. Kindergarten can recall familiar stories, including key details. First grade can retell stories. Second grade can recount, including, like fables and folklore, but that's from stories from diverse cultures. Determine their central messages, lesson, or moral. Students will be able to recall a simple story in the Dakota, Lakota language. So what we did was we basically went through the Common Core and then developed our assessment, our questions to do that, to match up with those. And this is where we basically ended, was to write a curriculum and to continue the assessment. And for some reason, when we got all this done and we had all the support of the schools, we started to utilize it at different schools and they didn't want to do it. I don't understand. One school board, who were mainly speakers, said it was too hard for our children. And every year we would meet on it. And to give you an example of how we set up to do the assessment, is we did it with a male and female. We have male and female versions of this assessment. So we train, we just call it testers, in each community, so that community's individual dialects will be part of the test, be part of the assessment. We train them, and but they cannot be the ones who are the teachers of the tests. They can't be the instructors. So we get community people who are known to be speakers, and we just identify those male and female in the communities, and then we provided training for them on giving the test. Then we said, well, the ones that teach the test, if this is going to be valid and reliable and whatever all those words they use for that, is we got people to look. And when we did the assessment, we had the student sitting here, the assessor sitting here, and we used a video camera. And they would videotape the assessment of each child. And then from there, we would have different people review the videos and score them. So there'd be other people from the community who we would train to do that. And then when they were done, they would send all of that to one person and they would just put down all those scores. And it would give you a good indication if these children were learning to read or speak and understand the language. In our, when we tested, we used 6 sections that we scored them on. The introduction, this is the speaking part. Introduction, conversations, mechanics of the language, expressions, the vocabulary of the language, and humor. And each of those, K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, all of those had all the same, that's what we were looking for, is when we tested those. But the testers, when they were doing the assessment, that's what was written as part of the assessment. So the ones that rated those assessments could look at these, and they're very involved, I guess. And then the other one was understanding, translations, interpretations, vocalize, expression, and rules of the language. And then each of these sections, like the introduction, they had 3 sections to assess. For an example, in the introduction, one of the sections was the children had to identify who they are, and then where they're from, and their relative, their family. They should be able to do that, and speaking the language. And then each of those was rated on a 0 to 4 scale. And there was I'm trying to get this across how much work they put into it. It's like once a month for 2 years they worked on this. And it was on a weekend. They would start Friday evening. It usually went till about 10 o'clock or later. Then all day Saturday and most of Sunday. And there were a certain number that we identified in the beginning, but as we went on, there were different language instructors that would come and give their input. And I have we developed a test manual, which is what's the word? You have to sign in blood that you won't reveal any of this. And these are some of the schools that were part of all of this. I'll just show you some of it. We dedicated to Lisa Reese. She passed away right towards the end of when we were finishing it. There's also some other ones that passed. Acronyms, not very many that we needed. Then the contents, language team, the introduction, overview, assessment, roles, responsibility, district, administrator, coordinator, school administrator, test administrator, and then all the other things that go with it. The documents. And most of these were the confidentiality statements. So when you learn, when we teach you how to give this test and everything about it, you have to sign a confidentiality. Because it's very, and here was the first team. Danny Seaboy from Enemy Swim, Daryl Laisbat from Porcupine, Greg Ross, Porcupine, DDA, he was at Little Wound then, Lisa Reese from Tiosh Pazina, Lisa Forshear from Toast, Ed Star comes out, Gilma Stans, Shirley Witt from St. Francis, and Meredith from St. Francis. Those were the first ones that we brought together, that came up with this idea of how we were going to do it. They worked, I can't even say how hard they worked on doing this assessment. So we wanted it to be valid, reliable, and at that time they wouldn't accept people just giving a test or teaching their children and then testing them and then telling them our children know all of this stuff. People wouldn't accept that. So that's why we set it up the way we did. So there were the instructors, the language instructors, and then the people in the community. We tried to identify 2 males and 2 females, to give the assessment, and they would assess each child using videos. And there was everybody was saying at the time that we shouldn't use videos because the children would be shy in front of a video camera. And I said, really? Did you ever put a child in front of a video camera? And it was I think it was the people who were doing the assessment, the assessors, were the ones having a hard time being on camera. But they weren't really on camera. The camera was up here on the child. And the assessment was done with pictures. They would put a picture up in front of the child and ask in Lakota real simple things like, what's this picture about? And they would answer, and they wouldn't mark anything down. They would just ask all these questions, and these questions were made so all of those sections I was telling you about would be included in how they responded. And then the ones who looked at the assessment, looked at the videos, they would do those marking and how they interpreted it. And those were also different people. And they were not the language instructors. So we made sure that there couldn't be anything where people said, well, those are your children. You'll say they did everything, they could speak and they can understand. And that we didn't do that. We made sure that every step of the way was different, just like the state comes in and you have to sign a security thing for the state tests. You give those tests, you send them off, and they score. It's the same way with this. And it's very reliable because I'll emphasize over and over and over again, this was developed by language instructors from the tribal schools in South Dakota. Wasn't anybody else came in. They wanted us to have some outside help, so they brought in this company. They were called Second Language testers. And this organization worked worldwide to develop tests for embassies. That, like if people wanted to work at an embassy, they developed a short test for them to make sure they were proficient enough in the language to work in that country. So they came and they helped us through, sort of. And one thing they did, and we didn't want to do it, is they said you have to standardize your language. And we said you can't. Because even every little community has their own dialects for things. That's what we wanted to get to. And they kept saying, well, nobody's going to accept it unless it's standardized. So that's why I have in here about standardizing the language. And I'll get to that a little later. So they came in and, we went through all kind of agreements and disagreements and, getting upset at each other about the language and how it should be done and worked through all of that in that 2 years we worked on this. And one thing I saw myself was in the beginning, when we came in the room and started talking, everybody was speaking English. And there was a lot of non-natives in there, and everybody was speaking English. And as we went on, about 2 months later, it was a mix of English and Lakota and Dakota. And after about 6 to 8 months, when you walked in there, it was like an immersion classroom. It was, because everybody was speaking Lakota and Dakota. And that's how they came up with everything, was speaking their language. The best way to put this assessment together is through their language, through our language. But they would stop after maybe a half hour, and all of the non-speakers, they would tell them, well, this is what we was talking about. And it was very uncomfortable at first, but after a while it was just a natural thing to do. And then I go back to what that one school board said was this test was too hard for children, and I worked as a gifted and talented teacher for almost 20 years, and these children thrive on challenges. Nothing's too hard for them because they know how to step up to these challenges. Look how they stepped up to all these things that people are saying about us. We have bad kids, we have the worst attendance. That's because that's what our society expects of our children. If we tell these children every day how good they are, that they're very intelligent, and our children are. I always tell teachers, when our children come in your classroom in kindergarten and preschool, their intelligence level is like way up here. And by the time they're in 5th grade, their intelligence level has come down to what you're teaching them in a classroom. So they can stand up to these challenges. I better quit that. I always get on these soapboxes. Where was I, Debbie? How smart are kids? So they worked on this assessment, and they had all of these discussions, like I said, and some of the arguments about how it should be done. And they finally decided on what this test does. And basically, like I said, it starts out in kindergarten just asking them real simple questions about, what they see in a picture. And however they respond, they get a score for it. Because, that's what everybody relies on is test scores. And we knew, because all of this was new, that our children would not do well on these tests. So we would meet at least a couple times a year and update the tests and the questions. And we asked the ones who were the assessors, we asked them to take notes on how these children were responding. We also discovered something else on the videos too, was that because, remember I said these second language tester organization said we had to standardize the language. So we had to write out the questions for the testers. And we found out that instead of looking at what was there and asking the child, the testers were actually reading it. And some of them were struggling reading it because it wasn't the orthography that they had learned how to read the language. And we found that out, and there's nothing wrong with that. Because our idea was to write the question out in English and then have that tester say that in their language to the child, and they'd be from their community. So like with St. Francis, it would be somebody in the school community, and we trained, I think we trained 4 or more people in that school area to give that assessment. In all of the tribal communities that these schools were in, we found people and we identified people in those communities to become the testers and then train them. And then we had update training every year with them, just to keep them current and to change. And one of the things we found out was, another thing we found out was, the way the pictures were and the way the question was, there was actually about 3 questions in every question. And for the younger ones, that was really difficult because they weren't sure which one to talk about. If whatever was in the picture, maybe it was an eagle and a horse and something else, and you ask them in your language, what's going on in this picture? So there'd be about 3 or 4 answers. So for the younger ones, we were going to make those a little bit longer and break them down into each question. Say like, what's the horse doing, or which one is flying, or something like, something like that, so it would be a little bit not as difficult for those children to do that. And that's when we stopped doing anything with this assessment. Because everybody, all the schools wanted to develop their own assessment. And they didn't want, I don't know why, they didn't want to use ours. So all of the schools said, we can do our own, so we just said, okay, and backed off, and people struggle. They end up doing a written test. And that's, to us, these language instructors from these tribal schools said, that's not how we're not really teaching them to speak their language, we're teaching them to read and write the language. And Albert Whitehat said that probably 30 years ago. And it was at a conference over at, what's that place called? Nakota. When they got all the speakers together and about how they were going to teach a language, and they all got in a big argument about orthography, and I remember Albert said that. We've taught our children to read and write the language and not speak it. So everybody from then on tried to look at ways to teach, to help children learn to speak the language, to understand the language. But it's like we're so ingrained on this reading and writing of how to learn a language, when it's, everybody that grew up speaking the language knows you just speak it every day. And that's, to a lot of teachers, that's really scary. So in immersion classes, what I see a lot of aren't really immersion classes, they're part immersion. We had the opportunity a couple of years ago to visit with a bunch of other people in Albuquerque and the surrounding area. We went to this one reservation, what was it? Where are those guys? Pueblo. And they had a Montessori immersion school. So we were allowed to go in there, and they said, if you don't know the language, keep your mouth shut. So we did. When you go in there, the instructor only spoke the language. The children either spoke the language, and some of them used English, but the majority of them used it. And these were little, what are they, Head Start? Yeah, Head Start children in Montessori. And they were all speaking their language. And then later on, the same group of children, we got to meet with all their parents to talk with them. And the parents said, and now when these children come home and their cousins come to play with them, they're all speaking their language. And we don't know how to speak it. So then they set up so that the parents could understand their children. And it was working out really good because the children were teaching the parents how to speak the language. But that was one of the real immersion schools I've seen. And now people are starting more and more to do that. But schools are still scared of that. Unless your school is full immersion. You know, that's it, you need to call it part immersion or something. So this, I always go off on these tangents, lose my thought. Where was I, Debbie? Somewhere in South Dakota. Yeah. Immersion, you're just as bad as me. Yes.
Chris, what is immersion?
What is immersion? Speaking the language in everything you do. I mean, just like this, we're doing immersion in English. Everything we say is in English. Everything we put on, we put up is in English. That's.
I have a great granddaughter that's in an immersion at Rosebud Mission, but they said, well, what kind of school is it? We said, who knows?
And then that's one of the things in that Pueblo is that the parents have to come and take part to find out what's going on. And they were very open to everybody. We were meeting over here, and in pairs we would go sit in their immersion class. He said that's what they said. If you don't know the language, then keep your mouth shut. Unless you learn some words and then you can speak them. But they, and they went to their tribal council and said, can we do this? And their tribal council said, yes, as long as you, what they say, as long as you don't share it with everybody, because we don't want people taking advantage of our language. Writing?
Yeah.
Well, the writing part. If you're going to write it, don't share it, because people will take it and take advantage of it and make money off of it.
trained in testing this, and does it expire, or can she keep testing?
Yes, we can keep testing.
Is the training available to others that are interested?
Yes, for that community, whatever community is. We had a testing, we were trying to, Lakota College, their school, they had a, immersion school, and they utilized our assessment, but they couldn't find any testers, anybody. There were some in that community, but they weren't available, so we opened it up, but it was just like, all of these people who wanted to learn about our assessment came and learned about the assessment. I mean, Peter Hill was one of them, came and learned, Harold, Geraldine Condon, Stephanie, can't remember who all, but it was like 2 people from that community actually came and became testers, and they helped out OLC to do that. But yeah, all of this stuff is still available. And then, but it always, a lot of times what it comes down to is, how much do you pay them? Well, it's up to the school to pay the assessors, the ones that give the test, and then, but we pay the ones who rate them. We have a fund to pay those who, they can sit down and rate all of those. And I think at St. Francis, one of them was Veronica, and they do, and she used to sit and do all of St. Francis's, rate all of those assessment. And then we would gather them all, and I think we were using Gilma stands, and we would send all of the everything to her, and then she would score them, and then send them back to me, and I would transfer those scores to a sheet, and then send that sheet back to St. Francis and say, this is where all your children scored. Yes.
Are all the programs, on the reservations the same? Are they all on the same page? Like, we're nurses and all our training is the same through the whole United States. So you should be able to, like, we worked ER for 30 years, just walk into another ER somewhere, know everything and just jump right in there. Is it like that with this language? All the reservations are on the same page?
No. It should be, but it's not. Everybody has their own idea, their own orthographies they want to promote. But that's just my opinion. But this assessment about it is, like I said, I identified 14 orthographies that are being used. I'm sure there are more out there, and there are some that people are developing. But it doesn't matter which orthography you use, because this one, orthographies are about reading and writing. This is an assessment about speaking and understanding. And we usually start out by charging $75 a student to do this, and that helps pay for things, and then the follow-up after that is, I don't remember, $35. So we do this as often as you want. Most people do it once a year. And then I think OLC was doing it in the fall, and then the spring, and then the fall, and then the spring. And what we found out, some of the things we found out was that according to testing, and this is like worldwide, everybody says, yeah, when they leave school in the spring or in the summer and they come back and they test them, they lose a bunch of it. What we found out is they don't. They actually gain, because their knowledge of their language, and it's like, that's who they are. That's who those children are. And they start questioning their parents and asking their parents different things. So when they come back in the fall and they assess them again, they test them again, their scores go up. And because they're learning. Because it's, like I said, we have two standards, speaking and understanding of the language. And at the end of the day, when all these language instructors would get together, they would sit down and they'd have two projectors, and one side would be Lakota and one side would be Dakota. All of the questions in the whole test. And that's what they'd do for the last few hours, is they would go through each of those and say, are these saying the same thing? Just to, like you said, just to make sure they were on the same page of the schools that, that use the Dakota and the schools that use Lakota, the dialects. So they made sure that we were all on the same page with those assessments. And it was like every month there'd be different people added on to that. So different instructors would come in and take part and learn about this assessment. And then we have a workbook that is public that I can share, but our test manual and all the test stuff we can't share. And I think you'll understand why. The state does that. You bring in tests from the outside, the state requires you to sign a confidentiality statement, and which is natural, because the amount of money we charge is very minimal to what other organizations charge to teach you the language, to help you learn the language. To us, it's up to you to help those children learn the language, learn to understand it. And what we put together is these language instructors came up with that. How can we find out from these schools if they're helping these children to speak and to understand? And that's through developing an assessment, because that's what was important at the time, and I think it's still important, because everybody talks about test scores. And that's what this is about, but it's also about teaching those children, helping those children to learn their language, to speak their language, understand their language. And it's, we went through, we made it, if the child was on an IEP, we wrote accommodations for that to be able to teach or to assess any students that were on IEPs. And usually it didn't matter if they were on IEP. Some of them did better. And there were a couple times, one in particular was a high school junior at one of the tribal schools. When he was given the assessment, he just blew it away. And nobody knew he was a speaker. And when the director asked him, how was the assessment? He said, it was easy. Because he understood the language. He grew up speaking the language. And there was another school that identified a fourth grader and people don't know that. We don't have any way to find that out, because we've learned how to suppress all of that knowledge, and we gotta just quit doing that. And that's basically, what our assessment's about, is helping these children speak, making sure, not helping the children, making sure the schools know that they're actually helping their children to speak and understand the language. And that's the important thing. Any other questions? I think, I don't know if everybody, we'll get a card around to you, and we have a few other, you want to try to do that? Yes.
You know, a few years ago, I thought about starting a talking circle. So, because everybody has phones. Of course, there'd be policies and procedures along with that, and it's only gonna be for the language. Cause there's people that are speakers, but they don't have anybody else talking. And I came up with this idea after my aunt died. She was the only speaker, you know, that I could speak with, and so after she died, I didn't have nobody else talking in my language. So I thought about starting one, so we started having meetings, and we named it after Dakota, Calvin there. And then my son-in-law. So I put it all aside, because my grandkids. It's still there, maybe
You
somehow.
can, yeah, I think what you have to do is just keep pushing it, and just keep doing it. That's the only way things get changed.
And those adults that, talk to you on the phone about the language and words, that sort of thing, they're actually maybe gonna help the little ones,
Yeah.
I thought. I didn't know how to read or write Lakota, but I could talk it.
Yeah, two of my children that went to school at Marty can read and write in Dakota. And then one of them taught, just from hanging around with a lot of people, can speak the language pretty good. And then my other two daughters are learning the language. But with me, I just never, every time I tried, I hate saying it, but people would laugh at me or feel sorry for me. And I don't want that, so I just, it's like a barrier I put up. And I need to, trying to knock it down, but that's hard.
Yeah, and then you were talking about, there's people that don't look like they can speak the language. We had a real good example. We're all assigned in the emergency room. So I had the trauma room for the day, and we got this guy, but he had kind of long hair, but really little fiesta. And he was kind of drunk and whatever, and so he kept, as I was taking care of him, he kept saying, how are you doing, all this and that. So I kind of kept that cool, I came out, and then she was out there in the bay, and I said to her in Indian, I don't know who that guy is, and here all of a sudden he hollered, oh, Auntie, how is snow? He said that.
Debbie's taking few gifts around in my card, so if you want to, I think I have it on here.
You ready to come back to St. Francis, Chris?
What?
Ready to come back to St. Francis?
No.
No, I know what this,
Yes, we'll come to any school and do this.
this is what we're looking for.
Cool.
These are my two language teachers and myself.
Yeah.
Be a young Lakota, the immersion school will start to happen. So we're gonna need something like
So
that.
yeah, if you're interested, just email me, if you wanna become a tester, we call them raters. And what's the other, there's another one where you put it all together. It's a long process in learning how to administer this assessment is a long process, because it, like I said in my, on my slides, you have to be committed to doing it and just keep doing it. And I think, we're not trying to tell anybody how to do it, but all of these instructors said, we need to ask them, are you doing this? Are you helping our children to learn to speak and understand the language? So with that, I think, maybe I'll ask Dwayne if he'll give us a prayer. Close this up.
Oiatona, oiakipiki, iwaneshikala. Ochikwa wopila, ukapuchipi. Wana takawa ukabla sapikila. Natana wanitu wichemna nupa. Tona Lakota wola kapikila na. Makawi choni iuki gina kapiki. Etana 20 Lakota itashni. Yote ki wakaja ki ukaishta pita. Tuwepte ki sukia pita shni. Cha oipshicha. Cha hena cha ukisha pita. We want to say a prayer and really think about why we're here and what we're doing and learning from each other, because there's some of us, many of us that are still speaking fluent the language. In 20 years, it's a reality when we're gone. If we don't do things now, the language is going to be gone. And that's a reality. So I think what Chris is telling us, don't be afraid to do it. That's who you are. Alache Takashila Matako Pazana, Iwogaki Yuka, Takashila La Kolia Pikala, Yotiki Waetiki Okupi. Yapikale Ukiru, Ugruni Piki Takashila, Wakaja Kilena, Nuni Manipite, Tuepteki Sokia Pitishi, Yatakashila Letana, Na Omicha Kilena. Natanta kushi naukubina ukabla sabna. Na chate wasabi ukabina ha. Maliyu kichapina ha. Dola Lakota yapika na takashya. Tagata yapika na. Echa wakaja echo skiku chapiki. Yecha pilu kichapikte. Na ukiecha. Ma betu mangitha piki makawa chuni yakina piki. Ujina takashnikta ukina jbiki. Tako je chano yabiki, kaka. Tako de bloedge, chano wachtje. Oyika, lena walake, lena omekeke, chaswake, wopila emche. Jambetikale, takashla, tonaleche, Nakota, Oceti Sakowin, was spijkelena. Leche skikuchapi, no kichuchona. Kabla zabalo takashla, kabla zabo. Uzani buchipi na Lakota le togata ki ya imani buchipi. Uzani buchigolo, mitaki oyas. Babo.
Thank you all for attending. Have a good rest of the day. Stay safe. Wear your mask. Get vaccinated.